Well, thank you. And first, I just wanted to thank the Kauffman Center very much for having me down. I'm actually kicking myself for not coming down last night and being able to stay for the whole day. Just because the discussion here has just been incredible, and so much of the work that that I've been doing for years is reflected in so much of the work that's going on now. And I have so much to learn from each and every one of you guys, and I'm just really, really sorry that I'm not able to stick around for this whole thing. So better luck next time, on my behalf, anyway. It's interesting, and it's actually kind of tough to follow that little excerpt from How to Survive a Plague, in the sense that usually Peter Staley, who was actually the one who climbed to the top of the FDA entry, he usually kind of gives these talks, like following a presentation like that. And me, I was in there, but I certainly wasn't a lead player, at least in terms of the demos and what have you. But I was there. Just a little bit about me. I've actually been living with HIV for 22 years. I've actually been involved in HIV education and advocacy pretty much my entire adult life. I really started when I was 21 years old, actually while in college, which is when I got hooked up into ACT UP. And then soon after I graduated from college, I started doing quite a bit of work with the Treatment Action Group, which is, to Barbara's point, really a spin-off of ACT UP. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So again, it's just a real pleasure to be here. And I've actually kind of titled my talk here today is How to Continue to Survive a Plague. Because the one thing I think is really important for us to understand is that I think while How to Survive a Plague really does depict how we got everything moving, how we got things moving, how we really got this off the ground, there's still such a tremendous amount of advocacy and activism that's still going on today, that's still so pertinent, but still needs to take place. So I just think that's a great starting point. So really, I just wanted to kind of talk about where we've been, where we are, and certainly where we're going in the future in that way. So just a little bit about ACT UP legacy, which is, as we saw, there really was a method to a lot of the madness surrounding a lot of these demonstrations and a lot of the activities that we saw with ACT UP. And really, it's just and I was actually drawn to ACT UP, not so much for the theatrics and the presentations and the drama of it all, but really there was a great deal of pragmatism it was really a great deal of pragmatism that led to the protest, that led to a great deal of results for us. So just briefly, a lot of the presentations that we do see in How to Survive the Plague really does involve a lot of our core programs that were set by ACT UP, New York's Treatment and Data Committee, which was really, we were the nerds. We were the ones who surrounded ourselves by the science. We were the ones who really figured out where our greatest problems were in all of this. And so with all of that, and really trying to figure out what should we be doing, and all of this targeting of the FDA, the targeting of the CDC, the targeting of the NIH, and the targeting of Wall Street, there were reasons for that, and there were direct results for that, and results that really have put us to where we are today. And these include accelerated HIV drug approvals by the FDA. To Peter Staley's point when he was on Crossfire, I think this is the key point that he made. And so the one thing we were very successful in doing is really working with David Kessler, who was the commissioner of the FDA at the time, to develop this accelerated approval mechanism for getting drugs, especially drugs that were intended to save lives, into people's hands as quickly as possible. There had to be the evidence base there, but we had to get those drugs out as quickly as possible, usually after phase 2, provided that there was a commitment. We'll talk more about that. Also fighting industry to bring down high price of drugs. We certainly saw this with what was then Burroughs Wellcome, which went on to become GlaxoSmithKline, which went on to become Glaxo Wellcome. I reverse that. It was just AZT was really such an expensive drug, and the one thing that we needed to do was to bring that price down so that it became accessible. We were effective in that way. Demanding innovative treatment IND, compassionate use, and expanded access programs. This was critical. We needed to find some way to get experimental drugs into the hands of those who need it, while at the same time securing access to data that we needed to develop informed treatment decisions. Also, and this is a critical issue here, which is access to NIH research programs, notably the AIDS Clinical Trials Group. But before this, it was just like you had the NIH here and you had the patient populations there. Nothing mixed. You do not have patients at the table of researchers. Well, this changed all of that. We demanded it and we got it. And we got a place within the NIH, in the AIDS Clinical Trials Group, to make sure that patients were represented in all different programs of the AIDS Clinical Trials Group, in the leadership and all the different research advisory committees. We insisted on that. And importantly, and this kind of actually builds upon some of the points that have been raised here today, we also insisted that every single AIDS clinical trials unit, and we used to start with 15, then we had 25, then we were well above 30 AIDS clinical trials unit. Each one of those units had to have a community advisory board. You could not get funding from the NIH unless you had a community advisory board made up of people living with HIV to help to review protocols and to help to drive the agenda. So that was a real critical issue there. Now, and yet, I mean, despite all of these, these advances, and despite a lot of these achievements that we managed, the fact is the death toll is still continuing to rise. The enormity of the crisis was largely being ignored by President Reagan and by the first President Bush. We also, and this is the point that Mark Harrington and Peter Staley both raised in a little excerpt, we really had no national HIV/AIDS strategy. And what do we mean by that is we essentially had no nationally recognized policies in place to get a way out of the epidemic. Oh, sorry about that. We also had no national research plan. And this is a real critical issue within ACT UP and certainly within the Treatment Action Group. We also had a poor understanding of NIH AIDS research programs. And also, and soberingly, we also have mounting failures of clinical research programs and too little emphasis on basic science. So I just want to talk a little bit here, just to drop on my nose, is that, what became an activist most in this sense? And it's like really, and despite, or really because of a lot of the setbacks and frustrations, activists, and there were a number of us within ACT UP, and a number of us within TAG, who we really demanded to be a part of the solution, to be a part of the research networks, to get our foot in the NIH, to get our foot in the various research networks that were being started up in response to HIV. Well, there's something critical there, which is you can get access, but there's still quite a bit of learning to do. And boy, did we really get an earful. And boy, did we really, we were really brought up to speed by some really high empathic investigators, statisticians, epidemiologists, clinical researchers, who really brought us into the fold. And it was through that, it was once we had access, is that we learned all about things like p-values, confidence intervals, bias, randomization, control arms, retrospective analyses, prospective analyses, data analysis in general. And that was critical. That was absolutely critical, because then all of a sudden we were armed with information, and none of us went to school for this. I went to school, I was a philosophy major. That doesn't equip me for any of this stuff. I hated science in high school, and I hated it in college. I actually went back and ended up getting my master's in public health, but it was like through all this, and you actually learn, you learn the practical skills of all of this stuff. So what did that really allow us to do? Well, a whole hell of a lot, in the sense that, number one, is like it allowed us to talk about the basic science. What's going on in basic science? What do we need to know? What do we need to know in terms of how HIV actually destroys the immune system? What do we need to know about those finite concepts of drug development? Well, that was something that allowed us to, having that scientific knowledge, having that understanding of how the actual NIH system works, understanding how biology actually works, it allowed us to do that. Number two is the issue of clinical trial design. And certainly when you're sitting there with the ACTG, that was really the gateway for us. We understood how a clinical trial needs to be designed to yield the most important results. Claims versus evidence. Now, this is the big situation here. This is something that it's really been a big thing for me. Is that especially during the early years of the HIV epidemic, is that what we ended up saying was like these drugs were crap, if you'll excuse me, And so we ended up seeing a lot of investigators who were actually working with pharma, who really wanted to kind of like, they're given lemons, they want to turn it into lemonade. So you start to see a whole lot of subset analyses that were being presented to actually show the better side of everything. Well, we didn't want to see the better side of everything. And I think that with this knowledge of how to actually analyze data, really provided us with a way to push back and say, no, that's not what this clinical trial said. This does not benefit me. This does not benefit my community. We're kidding ourselves with that. So it allowed us to do that, and that was critical. It was absolutely critical. And certainly, with this newfound knowledge, it really helped us to really develop evidence-based policy, certainly in the U.S. and under the NIH and through the various systems. Now, early campaigns, reforming NIH AIDS research program. And just quickly there, it's just like, through TAG, and this is where TAG's big entry into all this stuff. The one thing that we wanted to see, through the NIH, we wanted to stop seeing all the different research that was being done was being really balkanized. So you have these various different institutes with under the NIH. So the problem is everybody was kind of doing HIV research, which is good. The problem is nobody knew which each group was doing. So we were duplicating, we had a lot of gaps. So the one thing that we wanted to do was to ensure that the Office of AIDS Research was created in order to bring everything under a particular office. And it worked. And that was a particularly successful campaign. We were very, very happy with that, obviously. And the OAR, still to this day, does oversee all aspects of HIV research conducted under the NIH. Back to the basics, revitalizing basic research, critical. Some of the drugs that we have available today that have come out over the past 10 years are the result of us getting involved in basic research years ago, just to say, this looks good, let's move this forward. And it was understanding that, because that helped to inform our activism in clinical research. Bad drugs, AZT, DDI, GDC, D4T. There's a whole crop of drugs that were out there that were just not serving our benefits. And it was recognizing that. We were thankful. I think that for some people, those drugs actually saved lives. But it was really understanding how they were working, what was wrong, and also being informed about this and making sure that people understood about the toxicities, making sure that people really had a full sense of what we know about these drugs and what we don't know about these drugs. The issue of bad clinical trials. And certainly there were a lot of bad clinical trials back in the day. I think that even early on, if we take a look at the tuberculosis model, for years we knew with tuberculosis that we treat with a combination of drugs. We've known that for years. HIV, for the first 5, 6, 7 years, we were doing these sequential monotherapy studies. We knew that wasn't the approach. We knew this wasn't the approach, and the one thing we wanted to do was to make sure that we were developing clinical trials that were actually based on an infectious disease model and not this model that we haven't that seemed to be so new. Bad surrogate markers. What I mean by that is we knew by the mid-1990s that we could measure viral load. We could measure the amount of virus in the blood as a surrogate marker to beat out CD4 markers, actually a measure of the immune system. Of course, we want to see an increase in T cells. Critical point. But we knew that there were other ways that there were other markers we could employ in clinical trials to determine if drugs are working much more effectively, and when they stop working, to get people onto a different therapy altogether. Bad AIDS disease management. What I mean by that is, back in the day, we had a slew of AIDS-related opportunistic infections and cancers, and our understanding going into that was very, very poor. So we had to develop new drugs, we had to develop new treatment paradigms, we had to develop new standards of care for people who were living with AIDS, people who were dying of AIDS, and people who were very, very sick. Now, we'll just move forward a little bit here. So with that activism, I think with all these skills and these priorities that we had set into place, they've served us very, very well over the years. So just talking a little bit about the HART years, and what I mean by HART is really combination antiretroviral therapy, which still to this day is our mainstay approach. So over the years, and certainly working with TAG, it's really helped to reform our priorities in a way. So number one is new drug development standards, and these are standards that we still like to employ today. So maximizing efficacy and minimizing adverse events. We know that. We have an evidence base to look at So anything that repeats where we've been and doesn't improve upon, then we've got a big problem. And that's something that we certainly look for. Studying in all populations. Now, this is critical because I think that when we look back, especially over the years, most individuals who were involved in clinical trials, where there was a tremendous amount of empowerment, was mostly in gay white men. So what we needed to do, we needed to find this new paradigm of getting more people, African Americans, Latinos, pediatrics, women, enrolled in clinical trials so that we can get the evidence base to understand a lot more about how treatment affects them, how it doesn't affect them, and to move forward. Just moving quickly, just also, I think that we've actually seen, because we've accumulated so much data and so much research, we actually need to find some way to develop the evidence base around this stuff and developing best practices. And this certainly comes into the development of guidelines. And that, unfortunately, in HIV, I mean, even within the U.S., we really have two different sets. We actually have multiple sets of guidelines from which we can draw upon. That's all based on the evidence base. And activism plays a critical role in all of this stuff. I just want to talk about a little bit kind of like where we're at right now. And really, so we're talking about the modern era. And so where does activism kind of play? So we know this, and I think that the consensus, and the consensus is right, is that we are light years away from where we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, in terms of our ability to treat HIV. That's the great news. I still stand by, I'm actually healthier now than I was 20 years ago. And I mean, we have really treatment to thank for that, and modern day treatment to thank for that. But that doesn't mean activism is over. I think we have a whole different set of issues that need to be addressed. Number one, which is the issue of HIV and aging, because so many of us who've been living with HIV, we're all in our 40s, 50s now, which comes with a whole slew of problems. And I think that certainly within HIV, we're at a much higher risk of various different complications, cancers, cardiovascular disease, bone disease, liver disease, kidney disease. Our relative risk of problems is actually significantly higher compared to an HIV-negative age-matched population. So that's a significant issue. And that's something that that has to be drawn out, that has to be dealt with through science. Certainly age-related health complications that we talked about. Cure research. We're seeing the C word back in the news again. And that's incredible. I don't think it ever really went away, but I think that we've really made we've really made some incremental steps, at least over the past 5 years, that show that we can potentially cure this. We really can cure this. And that takes a couple things in advocacy, which is number one, just really keeping an eye on the science and making sure that we're putting the right science forward, but also making sure that we're not giving into a lot of hype. And there seems to be a tremendous amount of it. I can't even tell you how many media reports over the past 3 or 4 years that have really kind of blown an understanding out of proportion, which sets off a whole a vicious cycle of trying to understand what in fact is going on. Prevention modernization, and it's just really for the first time in years we have an evidence base of of something that actually works. And in this case, we have something like pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is great. One tablet taken once a day by those who are at risk for becoming HIV infected. We have an evidence base, and it's growing continuously. So we need to make sure that evidence base is reflected in policy that actually benefit people who are at risk for HIV. Certainly new tools, things like vaginal anal microbicides. Very, very exciting. We're starting to see a lot more of that. But there's a tremendous need for advocacy, not only to see that research conducted well, but to see it funded. So we're seeing quite a bit there. Engagement in care. Now, this is something that's a dear issue to me, and this actually kind of goes upon one of the points that I was raising before, that we have evidence-based practice versus practice-based evidence in this country, whereas we have really 30 years of experience. And what I mean by engagement in care is that only 20% of people who are actually living with HIV have never even been tested. Less than 50% of those who are living with HIV aren't being retained in care. They're not seeing a healthcare provider regularly. 25% actually have an undetectable viral load. Only 1 in 4 people living with HIV have an undetectable viral load. That they're on treatment, they're being well managed. And that's, in this country, that's just abysmal. That's horrifying. And that we have basically, over the years, we have invested billions of dollars in clinical trials looking at which is the best treatment when to start therapy, which is the best treatment. But we've invested close to nothing in terms of actually understanding how to get people from testing into care and retained on care. And so this is a huge issue for us right now. It's really, for me, it's the final frontier. And so this is something that advocates are going to play a tremendous role in. Now, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, kind of like personal lessons learned. Certainly by me over the past 25 years. Number one, and I think this actually kind of touches upon some of the issues that I've heard today. Health, treatment, and research literacy matters. And I think that, if you're meeting in some of the organizations that I've worked with, we tend to think of our diseases, our issues, in a vacuum. Cancer, HIV, cardiovascular disease. That's the issue we need to bring people up to speed on. Well, it's something much more than that. It's like we actually need our constituents, my fellow people living with HIV. They need to think about HIV, but they need to think about it in a much larger context of wellness, of health, of science, why that actually matters. And particularly in HIV, is like belief systems, especially those that are based on culture, religion, politics, are really tough nut to crack. There's a tremendous amount of science phobia, and anti-science attitudes are pervasive by those who are at risk for HIV and those who are living with HIV. So this is why I think that in the work that we do as advocates, and all that we're trying to do for the evidence base, and all we're trying to do to bring to the light of day, we can't forget the fact that we are also educators, and that we are educators really to make people more aware that science does work. The science is more or less on our side, and here's how it works. It's nothing to be afraid of, and that it really can trump a particular attitude. So also, we must not forget who we are. The one thing I found is, I think that, especially in working in HIV for, well over 20 years now, is like we become very familiar with the language. We get very, very comfortable with our peers. I actually end up doing much more work with researchers and investigators and healthcare providers than I actually do with people living with HIV. So my peers, my professional peers in a way, the people I go to conferences with, the people I have dinner with, the people are actually those scientists. They're the public health officials. And that's great. But I can't forget who I am in this. I'm there, I have to represent myself. I have to represent, my community. We cannot forget that, and that's critical. And if my voice is lost, in that world, then we're really in big troubles. Also, and this is a really important point, is that we can't underestimate the power that we do have. Sometimes it doesn't feel that way. Sometimes it feels, but we really, we can't forget that we really have yielded a tremendous amount of power as consumer advocates, as activists. And so this is critical. And one thing I'm always reminded is that power is capital, and it needs to be spent wisely. And this is something, it's a gambit, it's something that I'm having to think about on a regular basis. So I'm not going to steal Peter's thunder. We're actually going to be talking a little bit about this. So I just wanted to end with, this is actually our website, if anybody wants to take a look. Certainly a lot of our history is captured on the website in terms of a lot of the reports and the white papers and the campaigns that we've been involved in. And so on that, I will wrap up and we'll open it up to discussion.
Wow, that was great. Thank you so much. So I have two questions that were handed to me. Anybody else have anything? I'll start with these. The first question is, in breast cancer, the National Breast Cancer Coalition obtained hundreds of thousands of signatures demanding a national strategy in the early 1990s. We got the financial investment, but perhaps because it was organized by the government, it never really worked. How can we demand government action and get an organizational structure that works?
Well, it's interesting because there's been quite a bit of talk back in 2010, under the Obama administration, we did see the release of a national HIV/AIDS strategy, which is great. And that's, I think, the blueprint in which we're working off of. It's not our first strategy, though. And actually, we saw a strategy released under the Clinton administration that really failed to go anywhere. So I just think it's, in this sense, I mean, certainly around breast cancer, certainly around basically if there's any other different acute or chronic diseases. I think it really does. It depends on who's at the table, who is actually driving this forward. And I think that with HIV, the thing that's been a little frustrating with the national HIV/AIDS strategy is that we have this blueprint down, but we're up against a couple of barriers here. Which is number one is it's like we can come up with this really grand scheme of what needs to happen, but everybody forgets to mention is that the national HIV/AIDS strategy didn't come with any new dollars. It had to be reappropriated from something else. It had to be a reinvestment from some other place. So it's just really been about a matter of keeping this on the table, taking a look at what the other goals are to get more people into care, on treatment, and to really work towards that. And that we haven't really done that as a big group, but as taking it off as bite-sized pieces by different groups to move towards the particular goals that are actually spelled out in there. So perhaps that is a way forward.
And I just wanted to say that one of the things that occurred to me listening to Tim and again even watching that excerpt is that this whole notion of inside versus outside work, and we talked about that yesterday during our Q steering committee meeting, and how all of those demonstrations and all of the sort of ACT UP advocacy that you saw was a strategy in itself that went along with the sort of more inside stuff. So, maybe it's time for a March on Washington by consumer health advocates. They were really, really afraid of the negative publicity and of the action that ACT UP did. And they still, to some extent, are. Next question. As for demanding that patients should be at the decision-making table, do you believe the patients need to be aligned with an organization, or are individuals okay?
Absolutely, individuals are right. And I think the one thing that's been a real challenge for us, and I think that this kind of goes to my point about let's not forget who we are. And one of the critical aspects of that is really continuing to mobilize the community and to bringing new individuals into that. And that's really been a challenge in HIV. But to that point, is you absolutely, individuals, whether they're an individual or they're working with a service organization or they're working with an advocacy group, there's very much a place for individuals to be present. In fact, I think that individuals have a great deal to offer because they're not encumbered by particular politics. They're having to represent a particular organization's agenda. So that individuals, and we see this in HIV all the time, individuals can and should be a part of that, any sort of decision-making process.
I'm going to follow it up with this question because it's sort of related to that, and then it didn't come in the right order, so forgive me. How much of a role did the media play in accelerating HIV drug approval?
Huge. And I think that was the one thing what's great about ACT UP, and especially about Peter Staley, who was a media maestro. He actually liked to call himself a media whore because he was just so effective. He was just so effective, and he made sure that he was smack dab in the middle of it, that the camera caught all of that. And I think it did help to create a great deal of awareness around the situation. And so absolutely, without a doubt, media plays a role, just as media today, particularly social media, plays a tremendous role in how we get the message out about the work that's going on. I
know you want to ask a question, Anne. I'm gonna race through these and then get to you. What was industry like to work with in terms of price, allocation of their resources, etc.?
Well, I think that we've gone through. Let me put it this way. Today, I think every company is different, and I think that today, I think there are market leaders, and then there are those who are trying to kind of grapple their way up to the top in terms of the HIV treatment paradigm. But over the years, it was certainly interesting in that around the time that the protease inhibitors, which are really the drugs that revolutionized HIV treatment, is that some companies were certainly much easier and much more open to the suggestions that we made. For example, just to say, one of the first protease inhibitors, Norvir, which is really one of the first ones, one of the first drugs to actually show a survival benefit. They were really, really open, to working with us in developing.
Is that Abbott?
Yeah. it was Abbott Laboratories, was very, very open to working with us in terms of developing a clinical trial that would answer critical questions but would still provide some sort of a patient benefit. I mean, not to get too inside baseball with this, but basically it was just that you were going to do a clinical endpoint study. You're actually going to follow people until death. But what you're going to do is you're going to have a control arm that actually allows people to optimize their therapy, that they can bring in whatever they have and use that to try to keep themselves alive. And they were open to that. And it really did revolutionize the way that we still do trials today, which is optimizing people's regimens even if they're in a control arm, even if they're receiving a placebo. So, and I think every company's been different in that regard.
Okay. And there's a backstory to that, but we don't really have time to go into it because there was a protest against them when they raised the price of Norvir by the same community. So, FDA is going in the opposite direction today. Half of all drug approvals are expedited, even for drugs that are not emergencies. How can TAG help with that?
Well, I think it's interesting because the one thing is that we've tried to we will not stand behind. We don't stand behind Me Too drugs, and we see such a tremendous number of them. You know, and this is something with companies that they come up, they say we have this brand new drug. Well, it's not offering any advantage. It's like, wow, it's just like it seems like we don't have the lipid increases that we see here. No, but it still works the same. It's going to be used in the same population. It really does have the same safety profile. It still has to be taken with food. It still has to be taken twice a day. If there's really no advantage to that, then we just see absolutely no reason, to get behind that as for accelerated approval. And the one thing is the FDA had just come out with new draft guidance around developing antiretroviral drugs, and for those who actually qualify for the accelerated approval mechanism. And so the one thing that is, we have a very, very close relationship with the FDA, and we've made it very, very clear which drugs we do think that needs to go through accelerated approval, and importantly, which ones really should be going through the standard approval process.
And there's the next question that kind of ties in with that, because I have a question about that too. And that's about continually engaging consumers so that it isn't just, one of the things we struggle with at Q is there's a group of us that do a lot of the work, and then we have these huge constituency populations, but engaging them in the work more directly so that it's not just reliant on us, because we can have our blind spots, our prejudices, our lack of information that goes maybe beyond what are emerging issues among constituency. How does TAG deal with that? And this question is tied in. How are you compiling evidence on practice-based evidence, for example, prophylactic use of antiretrovirals?
Well, it's interesting because the one thing that we found is within HIV, I think we're really moving towards a paradigm shift these days in terms of, for years we've had the Ryan White Care Act program, which has really provided comprehensive care, like really wraparound comprehensive care, HIV-specific care, but comprehensive care to people living with HIV. Over 50% of people with HIV qualify for these for this program. Well, what's interesting is that we know that system has worked in terms of providing care, providing supportive services, providing drug rehab programs, psychological counseling. We know that the system works. Well, we're about to lose a lot of that through the Affordable Care Act. And it's okay because it's like we know that people are moving much more into a primary care system. We're going to see Medicaid expansion. Great. We're going to see more people going into to private insurance, which offers much more comprehensive wraparound services for whole health. Well, we're going to lose a lot of that, and we're going to lose a lot of Ryan White. We're going to lose that comprehensive care picture. So one thing to that point is we've been very, very interested to find out, well, what worked, what didn't work, what did the system, in different populations, what of that Ryan White Care Act program, of those Ryan White services, what has worked to actually keep people alive, keep people in care, keep people on treatment. And the thing about Ryan White is actually it's managed by HRSA. It's a HRSA program. So they provide the grants, they don't do research. So this actually goes to one of the points that I was building upon before. What we've asked HRSA to do is to say, we need you to sit down with the statistician. We need you to sit down with methodologists. We need you to sit down with the researchers to figure out how we can actually pull that data out, understand what worked, so that we can potentially roll that into things like medical homes through Medicaid, potential medical homes through the insurance program. So that's one aspect we're doing there. Things like prophylaxis, things like pre-exposure prophylaxis. The one thing that we're actually looking to do there really isn't so much it's doing the demonstration projects. You're not going to build a big evidence base. It's not a really big prospective evaluation. It's not a randomized study. But the one thing that we can do is, because we're in such this really new period regarding things like PrEP and pre-exposure prophylaxis, it's the development of demonstration projects in Miami and in New York to really figure out what works. I mean, who's requesting it? Who needs it? Who's not using it appropriately? What are some of the ways that we can monitor adherence? What are some of the ways that we can actually, improve counseling to keep people on PrEP if they actually need it? So it's through those demonstration projects that we can, which becomes a form of practice-based evidence in that way. It's not traditional. It's not how we've ever really made any sort of like healthcare decisions in this country, but it's a critical piece of the puzzle.
Okay, and Anne?
Anne Fonfo with the Annie Appleseed Project. And my question is, recently there was some news about reduced drug use. One of the drugs, maybe, I'm not good with names of anything, including names of drugs, but I saw an article about the main set of drugs being able to be taken at lower dosage, perhaps, or less time. And this brings up to me, it's really interesting. One of the critical things that I see about the way we do drug testing is we're always testing at the highest possible dose or the highest tolerated dose, and I think that is suck. So I'm interested that after all these years, somebody took a look at a whole different way, and I'm wondering if you guys are going to get involved with that, looking at things in a whole new way, and also anything going on with acupuncture.
Actually, yes and yes. It's interesting because this kind of builds upon one of the points that I raised before. It's like so many of the initial clinical trials, so many of those dose-finding clinical trials that we've done in HIV, so many of them involve gay white men. So when on a population level, it's like when you actually try to apply that to those who are smaller framed, to women, to children especially, it just doesn't apply. So we've kind of painted ourselves into a corner in that sense. And it's interesting because the one thing that we're actually starting to see a lot of work around now are things like pharmacogenomics, actually taking a look at some of the genetic factors that are associated with higher and lower drug concentrations. That's certainly important. But to your point, it was fascinating because one of the biggest drugs that we're using today is efavirenz, which is a component of one of the three drugs. It's a mainstay therapy. It's Estiva. Well, it's interesting because that drug is dosed 600 milligrams once a day. It's associated with some pretty profound CNS-related side effects. It's profound. And once you know it, it's just like as a component of treatment optimization in lower-income countries, somebody just said, well, maybe the dose is too high. So a study was conducted in sub-Saharan Africa to take a look to see, it's like, well, let's see if we lower the dose. Could we get comparable efficacy? And wouldn't you know it, we did. But that data is not going to hold up at the FDA in terms of reducing the dose here. So in a way, it's funny, our desire to do treatment optimization in lower-income countries, they're going to have the leg up because they can actually do that. Generic manufacturers can start to work around those clinical trial data. But where does that benefit us? So the one thing we are trying to move forward with that, and certainly this goes to the point that one thing that we're really trying to do to make sure that more women and more people of color, and certainly more pediatric trials are done so that we can get a better understanding of different dose responses. So that's critical. Acupuncture, I will say, over the year, the data has been incredibly mixed. But certainly within the application that it was being looked for, things like peripheral neuropathy, acupuncture didn't really, pan out. The evidence base didn't really pan out in that way, and that's disappointing. But I think for any number of other different manifestations that we see in HIV, especially in this day and age, unfortunately, we haven't seen a lot of, data that supports acupuncture in that way. It doesn't say that it doesn't work. It just says that we just haven't seen the right studies to explore that particular option.
I have one last question for you before we wrap up. About how many people access TAD's information, your website, your publications, your briefings today? About how many? And are most of them people either HIV or at consumer level?
Well, it's interesting because it's.
You don't have to give the exact number.
No. I don't know if our website is particularly popular with a lot of people living with HIV in the way. I think what happens, a lot of service providers and a lot of other advocacy groups they actually take a lot of the information that's on here and they translate it. I'll be honest, a lot of the information that we produce is actually very high level, and I think that people will tell you that they don't understand it, or it's the big old snooze. So I think a lot of this actually serves, because we're a think tank and because we actually do a tremendous amount of work with a lot of community partners, I think there's a trickle-down effect with a lot of the information that we do produce.
But that's an important role.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so thank you so much, and thank you too to everyone at TED who's still doing like amazing work, and particularly to you for coming, and to Peter who wasn't able to come, and to Spencer who's with us.
Peter's always the first choice. I'm riding coattails.
No, you were great. You were great.